Welcome to Chapter 11. Are you living the 5? Let's talk about the legislative branch and the top 12 highlights. Here we go. Let's start with reapportionment. Remember, every 10 years we hold a census. The census basically tells us the total population of our country. We divide that number by 435, and that basically tells us how many people should be in each of the 435 seats in the House of Representatives. How many people should be represented in each of those seats? Right now, if we were to do it right here, it would be about 780 some thousand people. So if you look at the total population of a state, and remember the least they can have is everybody gets one seat because they have 3 electoral votes, so everybody gets at least 1 House seat, every state, mind you. But this is how Maryland ended up with 8 in the 2010 census, and in 2020 we will see how that fares. Everybody's growing, but are you growing faster than other states? And as we looked at in this example, Texas growing faster, so much so that they actually gained 4 seats in 2010 at the cost of Ohio and New York that each lost 2 seats. So a lot of growth in the South and Southwest in terms of those areas, but this is how we determine how many seats in the House each state gets. Then the state legislatures can decide, and many of those working with the state governors to decide how to divvy up those seats. And then they would what we call redistrict, which is essentially taking that reapportionment and then redrawing the lines by each state in order to determine how do we get 8 districts out of all of these places. And that leads us to gerrymandering, the idea of redrawing the lines to benefit your party, especially if you're in charge. You want to win re-election, and so you want to make sure as many people in your state also win re-election. Well, as you can imagine, parties do this, Republicans and Democrats, and they do this all the time. We saw in Wisconsin there was a case, in Maryland there was a case, and both of those in the last Supreme Court term were actually, they basically said that for now that they don't want to get involved in that type of an issue. So they kind of punted on that and basically said it's political and we know it, and it's not right now a constitutional question. Now, they have stepped in on gerrymandering that was either involving cracking, packing, or the issues of compact, concise, and contiguousness, as you see in this example right here. The idea is that it's all got to connect. There is a highway that connects this, and this is all one district. Why are they doing this? Obviously to help somebody win and somebody lose, either in the district in the middle or in the district that we see outlined here, or both for that matter. But remember that the Supreme Court case of Baker versus Carr basically settled this to say one person should equal 1 vote in any district of those 435 all across the country. The idea of a state not redrawing their lines every 10 years is not right, because the country grows, and as a result of that growth, you have to change with it. And that means redrawing the lines to reflect the population shifts and changes to make sure that each district in that state is equal, or as close to equal as possible. And that was basically the 1 person equals 1 vote decision of Baker versus Carr. We have seen gerrymandering in every state in lots of different ways, all the way back to Elbridge Gerry back in the 1800s, and much of it has been unchallenged in the courts. Some of it has been challenged, and from time to time they have ruled that there have been things, Shaw v. Reno, an example we'll talk about, in which they basically said it was unconstitutional. But in a lot more cases than not, we see that gerrymandering favoring one party or another has been a constitutional question the Supreme Court did not want to address and did not want to get involved with. So malapportionment is a different story, though, and that's where the Supreme Court said, hey, 1 person equals 1 vote. If Tennessee or South Carolina isn't going to redraw their districts and isn't going to make a judgment, then as a result of this, we're going to make sure that you do. The whole purpose of a census and reapportionment and redistricting is the idea that states would then redraw their lines. And if they're not going to do that, they're inhibiting the 1 person equals 1 vote rule, the idea of the 14th Amendment and equal protection. How can you be protected equally if you're from a district that's growing but doesn't get any more representation in Congress because your state didn't redistrict? So this is essentially the problem that they had with Baker versus Carr. And the Supreme Court weighed in and said, said, okay, that's unconstitutional. You have to redistrict. It's inherent in Article 1 of the Constitution that we redistrict, because the idea here is that you got to make sure that one person gets the same amount of representation in their vote as another person in another district in another part of the state or in the country, for that matter. So that's essentially what they were looking at here, was the idea of one person equals one vote. Districts have to be redistricted in a way that each district is weighted equally. Now, they can be pretty crazy, as we've seen in Maryland, with how they do that, but essentially they do have to do that in making sure that every district in the state is roughly equal. And Maryland has gotten away with it. We've seen this in the courts. The court has basically said they're legal. We don't want to get involved in political questions. And they haven't. Shaw v. Reno, however, is a different story. Now, if they're redistricting and they're gerrymandering based on race, where they're trying to either diminish a particular voting power of a minority group, that's a problem. That's unconstitutional. If they're packing them all into a district in order to diminish their voting power in other districts, or if they're cracking them up into different districts as a result of trying to dilute their voting power, both of those are unconstitutional. That is what we call cracking and packing. That cracking and packing is unconstitutional, and the courts have upheld that constitutionality of being a problem against the Constitution. So Shaw v. Reno was an example in North Carolina where this was the case, and the Supreme Court weighed in and said, yeah, that's unconstitutional. You cannot do that based on race. It's a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Now, incumbents, don't get us wrong, incumbents are the people that are currently in office that are running for re-election, and they have a lot of advantages. You may remember in the chapter video I talked about the franking privilege, the idea that they can basically sign their signature up in where the stamp normally goes, and they get to mail for free. They can definitely do that. Now, they have to be careful. They can't do that 90 days before an election, or then it looks like it's electioneering. But they can do that 91 days before the election, and it's just fine. The name recognition, being on the evening news when they're at a ribbon cutting for a new highway or a bridge, or at a campaign rally, rubber chicken dinner, trying to raise money. All of the things that they do for people and the experience they have, riding with the president on Air Force One and getting a photo op, or shaking the president's hand or the majority leader's hand, getting commercials, ads with leadership in Congress. All of those things are advantages for incumbents. Being able to help a constituent and then say, hey, I helped a constituent. Remember that park that we got for you? That is something I did during my term, and that's why you should reelect me. That's a true quote, actually, from the forum that I moderated. One of the up in Frederick County, one of the elected officials used that very example of constituent service and said, remember that park that we just broke ground for? I was instrumental in helping get that park passed and the budget for that park so that we could actually have that park come to fruition. And that was something we did under my term. That's why you should reelect me. Those are all the things that he said. That's an incumbent advantage. A challenger doesn't have that, but a challenger does have some advantages also, because they can also say, hey, and especially right now, we're hearing a lot of, bringing about change. We're all about, new blood and coming into Congress and cleaning things up and shaking things up a bit, or cleaning house or whatever. A lot of those are pretty popular in TV ads right now as a result of what's happening there. One of the most important ones, and I kind of mentioned it with the park that's being built, is this idea of pork or earmarks. What is pork? Pork is essentially when a member of Congress is bringing home the bacon. They're basically bringing home money or contracts for businesses in your district, or bringing home money for projects like bridges or roads or highways, all of those things that they're able to come back to the district or to the state and say, hey, you remember that project? I got that for you. Remember that project that created all those new jobs? I got that for you, and that's why you should reelect me. And it is a very popular campaign theme for incumbents to use when out on the campaign trail. Now, a couple of things to talk about here in terms of pluralism and bicameralism. This was by design. If you remember, James Madison in Federalist 51 talked talked about the idea of a separation of powers. And by separating the powers and by separating the levels of government, national, state, and ultimately would be local, the idea was bicameralism was going to help with that, enhance the pluralism that was already at play. You had two chambers that were now going to be elected by different people, the House by the people themselves, the Senate by state legislatures, but the idea was you had them coming from different perspectives, coming from different constituencies, and being elected to different terms in different ways. House members for every 2 years, senators for every 6, senators having to be elected by the state legislatures, and they're responsible for the entire state. They're essentially going to be either reelected or not reelected by the state legislature, so you wanted to keep them happy. And then House members appealing to the whims of the people and making sure that you were doing what the people who sent you here wanted you to do. So there was a lot of pluralism in this bicameralism in order to limit government and keep government in check. Congress was designed to be that dominant branch of government. It is Article 1, not Article 2 or 3. It is first and foremost because there's 535 of them that are elected. And today we see with the 17th Amendment that senators are now elected by the people as well. But they're running in states. They're running in much larger districts than just a small, one piece of 8 in a district in a state like Maryland. So running statewide is a lot harder. You need a lot more campaign money. You need a lot more TV commercials. You need a lot more of that going on. And so that's where there's a lot of pluralism that we see today in this bicameral body. Now, the powers of Congress, we went through those in detail. You have those in your AP Gov notebook. But the idea behind this is that those powers are limited. There are checks and balances here. We know that the Congress approves the budget, but we know the president can veto that budget. We know that they can pass laws under the Commerce Clause and the Necessary and Proper Clause and change different things within the judicial branch or post offices or the coining of money. But the Supreme Court can rule those things unconstitutional if they go against anything in the Constitution. So there are checks and balances on those powers. Now, differences between the House and Senate, just briefly we'll go through these. The idea is obviously the size. 435 members in the House, 100 in the Senate. They're elected to different terms. House members serve 2 years, where senators serve 6. It is a much formal process in the House of Representatives. Because there are so many members, you have to have rules. You have to have formality. Otherwise, you'd never get anything done. In the Senate, much less formal. No rules committee in the Senate, where there is one in the House. They determine all of the committees that a bill would go through. When it comes to the floor of the House, who gets to talk, how many people get to talk, how long do we debate it, all of those things are set in stone before the bill goes out to the floor of the House. In the Senate, they may be debating a bill for days, weeks for that matter. There's a lot more freedom for members of the Senate than there are for members of the House in having that debate on the floor. And that was by design. The idea was that the whims of the masses, the appeals of the people was going to be more prevalent in the House, the tyranny of the majority, if you will. But the Senate was designed to slow things down, to cool the coffee in the tea glass, in the cup of coffee. The idea was to cool things off. Simmer down, people over in the House. Calm down and let the Senate kind of work things out for you. It was a very cautious body, much more deliberative in nature. And by design, they wanted it to make sure that if debate was going to happen, if legislation was going to get passed, if things were going to become laws, they wanted to make sure that it wasn't just the whims of the people that was passing it and railroading it through the House and Senate. The Senate being a much more deliberative body, they would take more time to do so. And that the bill that would go to the president's desk would be approved by the House and Senate, but with a much more cautious and deliberative type of conversation around it that really was able to yield the best parts of a bill that would survive, and other pieces of it would be chopped off essentially, so that what came out of it was a law that would work for the will of the people, the we the people aspect. Now let's talk about the Speaker. Sweeping powers of the Speaker of the House. In the House, he sets the policy agenda. And he sets the agenda. If you remember nothing else about the Speaker, remember he has sweeping powers. He sets the agenda. The presiding officer of the House is the Speaker, and he assigns committees. He will get the majority leader and majority whip to determine what the agenda is and how to carry that out. They'll whip up the votes, recognizing speakers and how rules are carried out, who's on the rules committee, and all of them are working for the Speaker of the House. So a very powerful position, and much more so than we see in the Senate, where the majority leader has the power. The majority leader doesn't have the power in the House of Representatives. It is the Speaker by and far, and they have sweeping powers in that the agenda that gets carried out is the will of the Speaker and what the Speaker wants to do. Now here you can pause this. This is the House leadership that we see. Obviously, this could change in the next few weeks based on our election. We'll see. We know Paul Ryan is stepping down as Speaker of the House, so there will be some changes and a shake-up there in terms of who's on the list in that leadership on the Republican and Democratic side to be continued. But that is the House Speaker for now, or the House leadership for now. The Speaker of the House, and essentially the Republican leadership you can see here, includes a majority leader, majority whip, and then they have conference committees, and this is the conference of their party that is determining their policy agenda. So Kathy McMorris Rodgers would handle that in terms of what the Speaker wants to do. Policy committee, again, they're looking at the policy agenda, carrying out the Speaker's wishes. Democratic leader and we would call this the the minority leader on the Democratic side. Would be Nancy Pelosi, and she is obviously hoping for a Democratic sweep so that the Democrats take over the House and she becomes Speaker of the House once again. But again, nothing is set in stone. It's all fair play, and this election really will be a good test to see if her message and the message of Democrats has resonated with voters or not. There is a lot of gerrymandering that has gone on over the last census in 2010, and we'll see if the money that's coming in will have an impact for Republicans or Democrats. Money being raised in large amounts on both sides, but to be continued. We'll see what happens. All right, so that's part one. If you want to pause it, or if you want to keep going, I'm going to launch into part two as we take a deeper dive into the House of Representatives and the Senate. If you remember last time, we talked about kind of some differences here, and debate is really a big one here. When we get to legislation, obviously most of the work is done in committees. But when they get to the floor, where they're really looking at debating the bills, at this point they've ironed out a lot of the details. A lot of the edits to the bill and that sort of thing has already been done in committee. It's been done in committee, what we call committee markups, which is where we basically mark up the bill and go line by line through the bill to edit it, and that sort of thing. And so then we get to debate, and there are lots of limits on, it's very structured in the House of Representatives in terms of how that debate happens. Much more limited. The Rules Committee is basically setting how many people can speak from each side, how long they have to speak, where in the Senate, people can talk for a very long time, as we know, with the filibuster. As long as they keep standing, they can keep talking about whatever they want to. So the debate could go on for hours, for days, just depending on how many people want to speak on that particular bill. So very different in that respect. Let's talk about the Senate for a second and go into a little more detail on their leadership, since we talked about the House in the last one. We have the Vice President of the United States, Mike Pence, is the constitutional head of the Senate, but he isn't there very often. He's only really there in the event of breaking a tie. Otherwise, we have a Senate President pro tempore, which essentially is Orrin Hatch. That's the longest serving member of the majority party. Right now, because it is Republicans, the longest serving member is Orrin Hatch. However, he has decided not to run for re-election. Mitt Romney, I believe, is running for his seat out of Utah. And so he is currently the longest serving member of the Republican Party, but he will not be obviously returning, so he will not be serving as president pro tempore. So to be continued in terms of who would go next there. I know John McCain, I think, was up for that as being a longest serving member behind Orrin Hatch there, so it might be Charles Grassley. We'll see going forward. But the idea here is that the majority leader has sweeping powers. It's really the majority leader that is in control of the Senate. They determine the policy agenda. They determine the agenda that gets carried out. There's no rules committee because it's less formal over here. And as a result of that, majority leader has sweeping powers in the Senate. So in the House, you've got the Speaker of the House. In the Senate, you've got the majority leader that basically runs the show, and that would be Mitch McConnell right now from Kentucky that is running that. And so they determine the agenda. They work with the minority leader in what the agenda is and what how long what the agenda is in terms of bringing up bills and how we go about looking at those bills, but again, it may be days or weeks before you move on to the next bill because senators have the ability to be able to talk a bill to death, to filibuster. Orrin Hatch is who you see right here. He is the president pro tempore of the Senate. Mitch McConnell, as I mentioned, is the majority leader. He is from Kentucky, and he is the one with the sweeping powers in the Senate. He determines the agenda. He determines what bills get brought up, what bills don't get brought up, and basically when they're placed on the calendar. Minority Leader Chuck Schumer is essentially the opposition. He is basically of the opposition party. He is a Democrat, where Mitch McConnell is a Republican. And so basically he is leading the Democrats and some independents that caucus with Democrats or meet with Democrats as part of their caucus, part of their groups of interest. Majority Whip John Cornyn is from Texas, and he works with Majority Leader McConnell in terms of whipping up the votes, counting the votes, making sure that they have the votes. They did this with the Kavanaugh nomination to make sure and work with people like Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski to see where they were on the issue. How are you voting on this bill? How are you thinking of voting? What questions can we answer? How can we help you decide? That sort of thing. And then Minority Whip Dick Durbin does the same kind of thing in whipping up the votes for Minority Leader Schumer in terms of carrying that out. So that's essentially the leadership that we see in the U.S. Senate today. And this is kind of a broader one. You can take a look at some of the other functions, but the Republican conference obviously is Roy Blunt is kind of vice chairman of that. He is from Missouri, and he would be trying to raise money and help set the policy agenda for Republicans in that capacity. We see the conference chairman is John Thune. And again, these aren't things you need to know, but just so you can put faces with names and kind of the leadership that's being carried out here that you might see from time to time. You may recognize some familiar faces from television and that sort of thing, such as Elizabeth Warren we see down here from Massachusetts, or Mark Warner over from Virginia. We also see Cory Gardner. He was in a big race in Colorado. You may recall back in 2014. He'll be up in 2020. And they're all in leadership positions, obviously for a reason. They're going to have to run for re-election if they're not already. I think Warren is up right now, and Warner, I think, will be up in 2020. But the idea is that they're in positions of leadership to carry out their party's agenda in terms of doing that. Let's talk for a second and kind of talk about the filibuster. These are basically obstructionist tactics. Talking a bill to death, essentially, is what a filibuster does. What's its impact on government? The impact on government for a filibuster is basically to slow things down and keep action from happening, a law from being able to move forward to be voted on, and essentially passed if you don't have enough people to carry that out. Now, we saw that this was 60 originally, And the idea was, actually originally it was 2/3 vote. You needed 67 votes. Then it went to 60. And in a lot of cases, especially with judicial nominations, and it wasn't the Republicans that did this. Republicans get a lot of blame for this, but it was actually Democrats. It was Senator Harry Reid that was in charge. He was the majority leader at the time, a Democrat from Nevada, that lowered the judicial nominations filibuster to a majority, 51, that were needed. And Mitch McConnell, who was the minority leader at the time, said, "You will rue the day that you have done this, because we're not going to be in the minority forever." And they certainly weren't. And so we saw Harry Reid left the Senate, but he definitely left a legacy there in terms of the change in the filibuster requirement, and I'm sure if he and Democrats could go back and change that, they probably would, after seeing all of the nominations, including the Kavanaugh nomination, that the Republican Party was able to get nominated and put on the bench. He filled one statistic by Pew Research said 1 in 6 seats were filled by the Trump administration, and obviously 2 of 9 on the U.S. Supreme Court. So that filibuster change, I mention it just to say that filibuster change really did have an impact on the number of judges that could get approved. That really changed some of the courts from an ideological perspective, from a beliefs perspective, because it really lowered the threshold by which you needed a certain number of senators, and it was a lot easier for the majority party, regardless of which one it was, in order to pass that. And we definitely seen a lot of that happening in the last couple of years. Now let's talk about committees. Standing committees, as you heard me say in the Chapter 11 overview, standing committees are the ones with the names on the door. They're the ones that are always there. And things like Armed Services Committee or Intelligence Committee or Foreign Affairs, they're the permanent committees. They're overseeing the government. So they're holding hearings, they're investigating, they're finding out what that agency is doing or not doing, what budget they're spending, where they're not spending, if they're over budget, why, if they're under budget, why, and really trying to get to the heart of is that agency or that department within the cabinet, are they doing their jobs? And that's really the role of Congress. Again, Article 1 was designed to be, Congress was meant to be dominant. Now, each branch was supposed to be separate and have their own roles and responsibilities. They were supposed to check and balance each other. But one of the checks that Congress has here is that investigatory authority to make sure that the bureaucracy is doing its job, to make sure that the bureaucrats and the agencies and departments within that are doing their job. And that's what a standing committee, all of the standing committees essentially are doing, is overseeing those executive agencies. Now, a joint committee can have House and Senate members. They're coming together for a special purpose. A select or special committee is very similar to that, but it doesn't necessarily have to have House and Senate members. Sometimes they have their own select committee on Benghazi, for instance, or a special committee to look at the investigation of the war in Iraq. Something like that could be a particular body. It may blossom into a joint committee in which the House says, yeah, you know what, we want to investigate that also. Let's form a joint committee and change that up. But that's essentially where they would probably start. Watergate is a good example of that, in that it was a special committee, a select committee, that basically brought that up those charges, and obviously that kind of unfolded into a lot of other things, including U.S. v. Nixon. The conference committee is essentially reconciling bills between the House and Senate. Remember, in order to pass a bill, you have to have the same identical bill signed off by both houses of Congress, a majority in each chamber, and the same identical bill is what goes to the president. If that can't happen, the bill doesn't go anywhere. It has to be the same exact bill. So that's really important. And who chooses the people that are on these committees? It's the majority leader in the Senate, and it's the Speaker of the House, and the leadership of the Speaker, usually their conference committee, that would their party conference not conference committee, but the party conference, the Republican Party conference or the Democratic Party conference, that would choose who are on each committee. And obviously, they're going to keep a majority of the members for their party and then give the balance to the minority party. And then the minority party picks their members as a result of that. All right, so what is a caucus? A caucus is essentially a group. Think of it like a group of people that get together because they have similar interests. Think of it like a club here at WJ. You have a club that you meet because you like to talk about certain things. I think of Model UN. They want to talk about international issues. And so as a result of this, this is essentially what a caucus is on Capitol Hill. Now, we have a number of them. Some of the most famous are the Congressional Black Caucus. And one of the most conservative that we've seen is the Freedom Caucus in the House. These are people of similar beliefs, and they tend to get together to talk about their ideas, their beliefs, and their ideology, essentially, and how they can move their agenda forward. Many times they're not necessarily all of the same party. Sometimes they are, but a lot of times they're seeing, how can we do what's in the best interest of, in this case, African Americans for the CBC, the Congressional Black Caucus, or the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, or the Congressional Women's Caucus. All of these are looking at issues that are broader than just the party they're involved in. But many times they do tend to stick with ideologically based, party-driven types of members. Okay, so let's shift from the caucus then to talk about, so then how do we get these bills through the Congress? How do we get them through in order to make this happen? And I'm going to do a really bare bones overview of this. If you want more detail, I suggest you go back and look at the overview of Congress Part 2, where I go into this in much more detail. But essentially, a bill is introduced, put into the hopper in the House of Representatives. The idea here is it goes to a subcommittee within a committee, and that subcommittee decides whether to vote on the bill or report it out, meaning to pass it. The full committee then looks at it and debates it. If it passes there, and remember, this is where many bills already die, but if it passes there, then it's going to go to the Rules Committee. The Rules Committee is going to look at it and say, does it need to go anywhere else? Any other committees that need to sign off on this? What do we need to do here? And they're going to determine if it's going to the floor of the House, then how long are we going to debate it? When are we going to debate it? Are we going to put it on the calendar? How are we going to give both sides equal time in order to talk about this bill? How many speakers are going to get to speak on this particular bill? And then when are we going to call for a vote? So all of that happens, all that debate takes place. It's very formal in the House. And then if it does pass, then it goes over to the Senate and the process starts all over again. It's going to go to a subcommittee in the Senate. And then if it's reported favorably or reported out, it would go to a committee. The full committee then debates and votes on it. They hold hearings. They call in witnesses and ask them to testify on things. And if it was reported out, then it goes not to a Rules Committee, because there is none on this side. Majority Leader determines what the agenda is and when that is going to see floor action. So then with that floor action, if it's passed by a majority vote and isn't filibustered to death, and they get enough people to pass it, and it's already gone to the House, and they have differences in the bill, then it would go to a conference committee. Otherwise, they're going to try and work out the differences and then send it off to the president. But remember, the bill has to be identically passed in both chambers of the House and Senate before it goes on to the president. That's the role of a conference committee. It's a very vital committee because they're the ones that iron out the details between the House bill and the Senate bill, and then send it back to the House and Senate for another vote. And in many cases by then, leadership has chosen who's on the conference committee, so they already have predetermined that what they want to get out of the conference committee bill is something that they can pass favorably in their chamber. Then it goes on to the president. The president has three options. The president can sign it. It becomes a law. Congratulations. The president can veto it. Then it has to go back and withstand a 2/3 vote, an override, if you will. And if he didn't sign it and he didn't veto it, he can leave it on his desk, a pocket veto. And essentially, the president has 10 days, not including Sundays, to sign the bill. And if he doesn't and Congress is in session, the bill passes. Congratulations. Your bill now becomes a law. And if he doesn't and Congress doesn't sign it and leaves it on his desk, a pocket veto, basically, and Congress is not in session, then the bill dies. So there are three ways that essentially works out. So he can sign it into law, he can veto it. Congress would need to pass it by a 2/3 vote, or he can pocket veto it. If Congress is in session, the bill passes. If Congress is out of session, the bill dies. All right, let's take a look at resolutions. The idea of resolutions here are more formal or informal in nature, but they're more for the formality of it in terms of a resolution celebrating National Poets Day or National, Massachusetts Day or something like that. In terms of celebrating a particular cause, many times it's to get the members or the senators on television back at home, helping their re-election chances or whatnot. So a lot of times they'll ask to pass a simple resolution that basically is just in one house, looking at their particular proclamation, declaring Technology Day for all of the hardworking technology entrepreneurs and blah, blah, blah. A concurrent resolution will be one that is passed by both houses. That's more a memorial, maybe a concurrent resolution honoring the life of Senator John McCain, or a concurrent resolution, making September 11th a day of remembrance for the victims of 9/11. That's a concurrent resolution. And then a joint resolution is one that would be signed by the president, and this would be one that, again, is more ceremonial in nature, but the president would want to sign off on. And the only exception to a joint resolution here would be a constitutional amendment, because the president wouldn't be signing something. But again, this could be a resolution that they're trying to affirm or show support for something the president is doing, such as a joint resolution on a proclamation of war against Iraq would be a joint resolution passed by both houses, signed by President Bush. The idea there is that it would show support by Congress for war without declaring war, and essentially giving the president the approval and support of Congress in doing that. Now, members of Congress have a couple of ways that they tackle their legislation. The two models we look at are called delegate and trustee. The delegate model is essentially they're voting the way their constituents would want them to vote. This is when, for instance, Democratic Senator Joe Manchin in West Virginia, a very conservative state, but he's a Democrat. He's a conservative Democrat, or moderate Democrat, probably more than conservative. But he votes the way his constituents would want to. Did he vote for Kavanaugh? Yes, he did. Did he vote because it was him that wanted that, or because he's trying to win re-election? Well, you be the judge. But just playing devil's advocate, I would say that he's more in the delegate model here, because he's voting the way his constituents would have wanted him to vote. President Trump won his state by 38 points against Hillary Clinton in 2016. Chances are he's up for re-election this year and running in a very tight race with the Attorney General of West Virginia. And he wants to win, obviously. So that is something that really weighs on a senator or a Congress member's mind when they decide on a delegate model or trustee model. I will say the trustee model is the trust me model. If you're electing me to Congress, you're going to trust me to make the right decisions. So trustee is trust me. Let me make decisions on your behalf, and if you don't like them, then vote me out of office. And if you do like them, then re-elect me. And that's essentially many of them go back and forth on this issue. Sometimes they will vote to support what their constituents want, and not really what they want, and then vice versa. But this is the delegate and the trustee models that we see here. There are a lot of bills that are introduced in Congress, over 8,000 at a time, and there are lots of ways that they make decisions. So it is not just one particular group that is influencing them every time. It's a number of different ways that they're influenced. Remember, the best way to a member of Congress's heart as a member of Congress is information. The best way to a candidate for Congress's heart is a donation. So information or donation, either one. But the idea is they get their resources and their information from various sources, from staff, from constituents, colleagues, from their own personal beliefs and interest groups, those people who try and influence them. The NRA or the AARP, the groups that are trying to influence them on issues that they care about. They're members of their party, and even their party's president or presidential candidates are influencing them in terms of their decision making. Why is it that Congress has such a low approval rating? They're such an easy dog to kick. I love my member of Congress. As I said this in the last video, I love my member of Congress. They do great things for me. They're awesome. But Congress as a whole, throw the bums out. They can't do anything. They're a do nothing Congress, and as a result of this, they get a very bad rep in bad street cred in polls and approval ratings, and we can see that evidenced here. Sometimes it's because people don't pay attention to what they're doing. They don't necessarily keep up with all of the minutia of what Congress is doing from day to day. They don't want to know. But a lot of times they know what's going on in their member's office. Hey, I called up so-and-so and they helped me out on this issue. That was great. But a lot of times they're not, and they don't get that extra help. And if they've ever been burned by a member of Congress, well, forget it. Then all of Congress is bad. But more often than not, the idea is that I love my member of Congress, keep electing them or re-electing them, but throw the rest of the bums out because they're no good. They don't do anything for me. Why do we need them there? And so that's why we see this back and forth. Hope you found this helpful. Good luck on the upcoming quiz, test, or exam, and live the 5.